40 years of marriage, and I thought I knew everything about my husband. I thought the late night phone calls were work emergencies. I thought the weekend trips were business consultations. I thought the new cologne and pressed shirts were just him taking better care of himself in retirement. I was wrong about everything. The man I shared a bed with for 4 decades, the man whose coffee I made every morning, the man whose name I took when I was 27 years old. He was a stranger. And on what should have been the most beautiful night of our lives together, he vanished into thin air, leaving me with nothing but questions and a broken heart that I didn't even know was already shattered. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of betrayal in long marriages. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Margaret Johnson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 67 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was living a blessed life. I taught elementary school for 35 years, watching thousands of children learn to read and write, seeing their faces light up when they finally understood something that had been puzzling them. I retired 3 years ago, looking forward to spending my golden years with Bob, my husband of 40 years. Bob and I met when I was 25 and he was 27. He was an insurance salesman then, charming and confident with a smile that could light up a room. He wore nice suits and always smelled like aftershave. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, I said yes without hesitation. We had a small wedding at the Methodist church where I grew up, with just our families and closest friends. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me, and Bob looked so handsome in his rented tuxedo. For decades, our life followed a comfortable rhythm. Bob worked hard building up his insurance agency. I taught school and took care of our home. We never had children, something that caused me great sadness in my younger years. But Bob always said we were enough for each other. We had our routines, our traditions, our quiet evenings together watching television. It wasn't passionate or dramatic, but it was steady and safe, and I thought that was what real love looked like after all those years. Bob retired 3 years ago when he turned 66. I had already been retired for a few months, and I was so excited about finally having him home with me all the time. We could travel, we could spend long mornings over coffee, we could take up hobbies together. At least, that's what I imagined. But retirement didn't bring us closer together the way I had hoped. Bob seemed restless, almost agitated by having so much time at home. He started taking what he called consulting jobs, helping other insurance agencies with their books, training new salespeople, that sort of thing. At first, these jobs were local, just a few hours here and there. But gradually, they began to take him farther from home and for longer periods. "It's good money, Maggie," he would say when I expressed concern about how often he was away. "And it keeps my mind sharp. You don't want me sitting around the house getting soft, do you?" I didn't. Of course, I wanted him to be happy and fulfilled, but I had imagined our retirement differently. I had imagined us together. The consulting jobs became more frequent and took him farther away. Weekend trips to cities 2 or 3 hours from our suburban home became common. He would pack a small overnight bag, kiss me goodbye on Friday afternoon, and return Sunday evening with stories about difficult clients and complicated problems he had solved. "You wouldn't be interested in the details," he would say when I asked about his work. "It's just boring business stuff." I accepted this. Bob had always handled our finances and business matters. He was good with numbers and people, and I trusted him completely. If he said something was boring business stuff, I believed him. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The new attention to his appearance. He started buying expensive shirts and getting his hair cut more frequently. The cell phone that was always face down on the table and that he took with him even when he went to the bathroom. The way he would step outside to take certain phone calls, saying they were confidential client matters. The subtle changes in his vocabulary, little expressions and phrases that seemed to come from somewhere else. I told myself these were just signs that his consulting work was going well, that he was feeling more confident and successful. I was proud of him for staying active in retirement. Many of our friends' husbands had struggled with the transition, becoming depressed or difficult to live with. Bob seemed energized by his work, and I thought that was a good thing. Our 40th anniversary was approaching, April 15th, 2024. I had been planning something special for months. 40 years is a Ruby anniversary, and I wanted to celebrate properly. I made reservations at Chez Laurent, the finest restaurant in our city, the same place where Bob had taken me for our 5th anniversary. I bought a new dress, a deep red one that I thought would be appropriate for a Ruby celebration. I even splurged on new jewelry, ruby earrings that I found at an estate sale. Bob seemed enthusiastic about the celebration when I told him about my plans. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart," he said, using the pet name he had called me since our dating days. 40 years. Can you believe it? I couldn't believe it. 40 years of sharing a life with another person, of building something together, of being part of a team. Despite the loneliness I had been feeling with all his traveling, I felt grateful for what we had built together. Our little house was paid off. We had enough savings to live comfortably. We had our health. We had each other. The week before our anniversary, Bob seemed unusually distracted. He spent a lot of time on his phone, stepping out onto the back porch to take calls. When I asked if everything was all right, he said one of his consulting clients was having a crisis and he might need to travel unexpectedly. "Not on our anniversary, I hope," I said, only half joking. No, he assured me. "I wouldn't miss our anniversary. This is important." But on Friday, April 12th, 3 days before our anniversary, Bob's phone rang during dinner. He glanced at the caller ID and his face grew serious. "I have to take this," he said, stepping onto the porch as usual. I could hear the murmur of his voice through the sliding glass door, but I couldn't make out words. The conversation went on for nearly 20 minutes. When he came back inside, he looked troubled. "What's wrong?" I asked. "It's the Henderson account," he said, referencing a consulting client he had mentioned before. "They're having serious problems. I might need to drive up there this weekend." My heart sank. "But Bob, our anniversary is Monday. Can it wait?" "I hope so," he said. Let me see how Day passed, quietly. Bob seemed tense and kept checking his phone. Sunday was the same. I started to feel a knot of anxiety in my stomach, but I told myself everything would be fine. Bob had never missed an important occasion in all our years together. Monday morning, April 15th, our anniversary, I woke up early and made Bob's favorite breakfast. Blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup. I put the ruby earrings on the table next to his plate as a surprise. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart," I said when he came into the kitchen. He smiled and kissed me, but something seemed off. He was distracted, not really present. He admired the earrings and thanked me, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. At 10:30, his phone rang. I watched his face as he answered, and my heart began to sink. I knew that look. I had seen it too many times before. "I understand," he said into the phone. "Yes. I can be there by 3 o'clock. He hung up and turned to me with an expression of regret that looked almost convincing. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. The Henderson situation has become critical. They need me there today, or they're going to lose a major client. It's an emergency." I felt like I had been slapped. "Today, Bob. It's our anniversary. We have reservations. I bought a new dress." I know. And I feel terrible about this. But this client represents a significant portion of my consulting income. If I don't go, we could lose them entirely. I wanted to argue, to tell him that our anniversary was more important than any client. But I had been raised to be supportive and understanding. And Bob had always been a responsible provider. If he said this was important, it must be. "When will you be back?" I asked quietly. "Tomorrow night, probably. We'll celebrate then, I promise. We'll go somewhere even nicer than Chez Laurent." He packed quickly and was gone by noon, leaving me alone on our 40th anniversary with a new red dress hanging in the closet and reservations for 2 at an expensive restaurant. I spent the afternoon feeling sorry for myself, then decided I was being selfish. Bob was working hard to secure our financial future. The least I could do was be supportive. I called the restaurant and cancelled our reservations, then settled in for a quiet evening at home. But as the hours passed, I found myself feeling more and more unsettled. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Bob had been consulting for various companies for 3 years, and while he had traveled frequently, he had never before left town on such short notice for what he described as a critical emergency. Around 8 o'clock, I had an idea. Bob had mentioned that he was staying at the Hampton Inn near the client's office, the same place he had stayed before when working with this particular company. I thought I would surprise him by having his favorite dinner delivered to his hotel room. A gesture of support and love despite my disappointment about our anniversary. I called Mario's, an Italian restaurant that delivered, and arranged for them to send Bob's favorite meal, chicken parmesan with a side of fettuccine alfredo, to room 237 at the Hampton Inn, the room number he had mentioned in previous trips. 45 minutes later, the delivery driver called me back. "Madam, I'm at the Hampton Inn, but the desk clerk says there's no Robert Johnson registered here. Are you sure you have the right hotel?" My blood went cold. "Are you sure? Can you check again?" "Robert Johnson? Checked in today." "I've checked twice, ma'am. There's no one by that name registered at this hotel, and the desk clerk has been here all day. She says no one by that description has checked in." I hung up the phone with shaking hands. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Bob had changed hotels at the last minute. Maybe the client had arranged different accommodations. Maybe I had remembered the hotel name wrong. But as I sat alone in my living room on my 40th anniversary, with my husband nowhere to be found and no way to reach him, his phone was going straight to voicemail. I began to wonder if I really knew my husband at all. That night was the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my life. But it was also the beginning of discovering who I really was and what I was capable of when everything I believed in was stripped away. Tomorrow, I would start asking questions. And the answers I found would change everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound, hoping to hear Bob's car in the driveway, his key in the lock, his voice calling out an explanation that would make everything make sense again. But the house remained silent except for the familiar creaks and sighs of our 40-year-old home settling around me. By 5 in the morning, I had convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation. Bob had probably changed hotels at the last minute. Or perhaps the client had arranged corporate housing. Or maybe I had simply remembered the wrong hotel name. After 40 years of marriage, I owed him the benefit of the doubt. But when I tried calling him at 6, 7, and 8 o'clock, his phone continued going straight to voicemail. The cheerful recorded message, "You've reached Bob Johnson. Leave a message and I'll get back to you," began to sound mocking after the 5th time I heard it. By 9 o'clock, I was dressed and determined to take action. If Bob wouldn't answer his phone, I would find him myself. I had the address of Henderson and Associates, the consulting client he had mentioned. It was about 2.5 hours away in Millerville, a mid-sized city where Bob claimed to have done several consulting jobs over the past year. I hadn't driven that far by myself in years. Bob usually did all the long-distance driving, claiming that highway traffic made me nervous. But I wasn't nervous that morning. I was desperate for answers. The drive to Millerville gave me time to think, and the more I thought, the more questions arose. In 3 years of consulting work, Bob had never once invited me to accompany him on a business trip. He had never suggested that we make a weekend getaway out of one of his consulting jobs, even when they were in cities with nice restaurants or shopping. He had never brought home business cards from his clients or mentioned their names in casual conversation beyond the handful he referenced repeatedly. Henderson and Associates, Brookstone Insurance, Meridian Financial Services. When I reached Millerville, I used the GPS on my phone to find Henderson and Associates. The address led me to a small strip mall on the outskirts of town. I parked in front of a modest storefront with Henderson and Associates painted in simple black letters on the window. The office was tiny, just a reception area with 2 desks and a small conference room visible through a glass partition. A young woman with bright pink hair sat at one of the desks. "Can I help you?" she asked when I walked in. "I'm looking for my husband," I said, suddenly feeling foolish. "Robert Johnson. He's been doing consulting work for you." The young woman looked puzzled. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name. And we don't use outside consultants. It's just Mr. Henderson and me here." My stomach dropped. "Are you sure? He's been working with you for months. He was supposed to be here yesterday for an emergency consultation." "I'm positive," she said kindly. "I handle all of Mr. Henderson's appointments and correspondence. We've never hired any consultants, and no one named Robert Johnson has been here." I drove back home in a daze. Bob had lied about where he was going. But why? And if he wasn't consulting for Henderson and Associates, what had he been doing on all those weekend trips over the past 3 years? When I got home, I went straight to Bob's home office, a small room off our bedroom that he used for paperwork and phone calls. I had rarely gone in there over the years, respecting his privacy and trusting him to handle our business matters. But trust was becoming a luxury I could no longer afford. The office was neat and organized, as Bob always kept it. His desk held the usual items: a computer, a printer, pens, and a stack of files. I started with the files, looking for anything related to his consulting work. What I found made no sense. There were files for Henderson and Associates, Brookstone Insurance, and Meridian Financial Services, but they contained no actual business documents. Instead, each file held printouts of company websites, generic information about the insurance industry, and handwritten notes in Bob's careful script that seemed to be preparations for conversations rather than records of actual work performed. The Henderson and Associates file contained a printout of their website, a street map showing the location of their office, and notes like, "Small family business, father-daughter team. Been operating for 15 years, and main focus on auto and homeowner policies, some small business accounts." These weren't the notes of someone working with a company. They were the notes of someone studying a company from the outside. I turned on Bob's computer, my hands trembling slightly. I had never used his computer before, but he had never hidden the password from me. It was Maggie 1984, the year we were married. The fact that he had used my name and our wedding year as his password made what I was doing feel even more like a betrayal, but I pushed that feeling aside. His email account revealed more questions than answers. There were indeed emails from Henderson and Associates, but they were responses to inquiries Bob had made about their services, not correspondence with a client. The emails from the other companies he claimed to consult for followed the same pattern. They were responses to Bob's questions about their businesses, not actual work arrangements. But there were other emails that confused me even more. Messages from rental car companies confirming reservations, hotel confirmations for cities I had never heard Bob mention, and strangest of all, several emails from a company called Eternal Moments Photography, discussing wedding packages and ceremony coverage. My first thought was that Bob must be planning something special for us, perhaps a vow renewal ceremony for our anniversary. But the dates on the emails were wrong. They were from 6 months ago, and they referenced events that had already taken place. One email in particular caught my attention. It was from a photographer named Jessica Martinez, dated October 15th of the previous year. "Dear Mr. Johnson, thank you for choosing Eternal Moments Photography for your special day. I've attached the final edited photos from your October 10th ceremony. You and Sarah looked absolutely radiant, and I was honored to capture such a beautiful celebration of love. Please let me know if you need any additional prints or if you'd like to order our premium wedding album. Wishing you both a lifetime of happiness. Jessica." I read the email 3 times before the words sank in. A wedding ceremony. On October 10th, Bob with someone named Sarah. Looking radiant. A celebration of love. My husband had gotten married to another woman. The room began to spin, and I had to sit down in Bob's desk chair to keep from falling. 40 years of marriage, and Bob had married someone else. Not divorced me, married someone else. Which meant he was a bigamist. Which meant our entire life together was a lie. With shaking fingers, I opened the attachment to Jessica Martinez's email. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. It was a professional wedding photo of Bob in a black tuxedo, standing next to a woman I had never seen before. She was younger than me, probably in her late 40s or early 50s, with blonde hair styled in an elegant updo. She wore a beautiful white wedding dress and held a bouquet of white roses. Bob was smiling at her with an expression of pure joy. Look I realized I hadn't seen on his face in years, certainly not when he looked at me. The woman, Sarah, was beautiful, but it wasn't her beauty that made my chest tighten with pain. It was the way Bob was looking at her. Like she was his whole world, like she was the love of his life. I scrolled through the other photos in the folder. There were dozens of them. Bob and Sarah cutting cake, dancing together, kissing, surrounded by friends and family I didn't recognize. Bob looked happier than I had seen him in decades. In every photo, he looked like a man celebrating the best day of his life. I had to run to the bathroom to be sick. When I finally stopped vomiting and could think clearly again, I forced myself to go back to the computer. I needed to know everything. I needed to understand how long this had been going on, how elaborate his deception was, how much of our life together had been a lie. I spent the rest of the day going through Bob's computer files, his emails, and his desk drawers. What I found painted a picture of a man who had been living a completely separate life for years. Sarah Henderson, the same last name as the fake consulting company. That was how he had come up with his cover story. He had created an entire fictional business relationship to hide his real relationship with this woman. From what I could piece together from emails and photos, Bob and Sarah had been together for at least 3 years, maybe longer. She lived in Millerville, which explained his frequent trips there. She worked as a real estate agent and had been married before. There were photos of her with a teenage daughter who looked like her. Bob had been systematically deceiving me for years. Every weekend trip, every late-night phone call, every excuse about work emergencies. It had all been lies to cover up his other life. His life with Sarah. But the worst part wasn't the lies or even the bigamy. The worst part was the happiness I saw in those photos. Bob looked like a completely different person with Sarah. Younger, more alive, more genuinely joyful than I could remember him ever looking with me. How long had I been married to a man who didn't want to be married to me? How long had I been living with someone who was just going through the motions while his real life, his real happiness, was somewhere else entirely? As the sun set on what should have been the day after our 40th anniversary celebration, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by printed emails and wedding photos, trying to figure out what to do next. I could confront Bob when he returned. I could demand answers, threaten divorce, make a scene. But what would that accomplish? He had already made his choice. He had chosen Sarah. He had chosen a life without me in any meaningful way. Or I could stay quiet and pretend I knew nothing, continue living the lie that had apparently been our marriage for years. But I didn't think I could do that. I didn't think I could look at Bob across the breakfast table, knowing what I knew, and pretend everything was normal. There was a third option, one that scared me but also felt strangely liberating. I could take control of the situation. I could investigate further, gather evidence, and decide how to proceed based on facts rather than emotion. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to have to figure out who I was without Bob and what I wanted my life to look like going forward. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with a determination I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to be a survivor, and I was going to start by finding out everything there was to know about my husband's secret life. Bob returned home Tuesday evening, exactly when he said he would. I heard his car in the driveway at 6:30 p.m. and watched through the living room window as he gathered his overnight bag from the trunk. He looked relaxed, even cheerful, humming a tune I didn't recognize as he walked up our front steps. "Honey, I'm home," he called out as he came through the door, using the same phrase he had used for decades. "How did it go?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal despite the rage and heartbreak churning in my stomach. "Oh, the usual crisis that wasn't really a crisis," he said, loosening his tie. "But we got everything sorted out. The client is happy, and they want to extend my contract for another 6 months." Every word was a lie. Every casual gesture, every familiar routine, was part of an elaborate performance he had been giving for years. I watched him settle into his recliner and reach for the remote control, the same thing he did every evening, and I marveled at how normal he seemed. How could someone live such a double life and show no signs of stress or guilt? "I'm sorry about our anniversary," he continued, not looking at me as he flipped through television channels. "But I promise we'll celebrate this weekend." "Of course," I said. "I understand." But I didn't understand anything anymore. I didn't understand how the man I had lived with for 40 years could look me in the eye and lie so effortlessly. I didn't understand how he could come home to me after spending days with another woman, his other wife. I didn't understand how I could have been so completely fooled for so long. That night, I lay awake listening to Bob sleep peacefully beside me. This man who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible was sleeping like a baby, without a care in the world. Meanwhile, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions and plans. I needed help. I needed someone with experience in investigation, someone who could help me uncover the full extent of Bob's deception before I decided what to do about it. I needed to know if there were financial implications I wasn't aware of, if there were legal issues I needed to protect myself from, if there were other secrets waiting to be discovered. The next morning, after Bob left for what he claimed was a local meeting with a potential new client, I walked next door to talk to Linda Patterson. Linda and I had been neighbors for 8 years, ever since she moved in after her divorce. She was 15 years younger than me, a single mother with 2 teenage children who were now in college. We were friendly but not close, the kind of neighbors who chatted over the fence about gardening and borrowed cups of sugar from each other, but didn't share personal problems or spend social time together. What I knew about Linda's work came mainly from neighborhood gossip. She was a private investigator who specialized in what she called domestic cases: cheating spouses, custody disputes, insurance fraud. Some of the other neighbors considered her profession slightly scandalous, but I had always admired her independence and strength. Raising 2 children alone while building a business took courage. I had never imagined I would need her professional services. "Maggie," Linda said when she opened her front door, surprise clear in her voice. "What brings you by so early?" "I need to talk to you," I said. "About your work." "I think I need your help." Linda's expression shifted from neighborly friendliness to professional concern. She invited me in and led me to her kitchen, where she poured us both coffee and settled across from me at her small breakfast table. "What's going on?" she asked gently. The whole story poured out of me. Bob's frequent absences, the lies about consulting work, my discovery that Henderson and Associates had never hired him, the wedding photos on his computer. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I talked. When I finished, Linda was quiet for a long moment. "Maggie," she said finally, "I'm so sorry. This must be devastating for you." "I don't even know what I'm feeling," I admitted. "Angry, heartbroken, confused, embarrassed. But mostly I just want to know the truth. All of it. I can't make decisions about my life when I don't know what's real and what isn't." Linda nodded. "That's exactly the right approach. Before you confront Bob or make any major decisions, you need to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. There could be financial issues, legal complications, even other relationships you don't know about yet. Other relationships, I hadn't even considered that possibility." "I'm not saying there are," Linda said quickly. "But in my experience, when someone is capable of maintaining one secret relationship for years, there's often more than meets the eye. We need to be thorough." We spent the next hour discussing what Linda would need to conduct a proper investigation. She explained that she would need access to financial records, Bob's schedule and habits, and permission to conduct surveillance when necessary. "This isn't going to be easy for you," Linda warned. "Investigation means uncovering every detail, even the ones that might hurt. Are you sure you want to know everything?" I thought about Bob sleeping peacefully beside me while I lay awake in agony. I thought about him humming as he walked up our front steps after spending days with Sarah. I thought about the joy on his face in those wedding photos he had never shown with me. "Yes," I said, "I want to know everything." Linda's fee was reasonable, $75 an hour plus expenses. The money would come from our joint savings account, which felt like poetic justice. Bob would unknowingly pay for the investigation into his own deception. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda worked methodically to uncover the details of Bob's secret life. She tracked his movements, conducted surveillance during his supposed consulting trips, and used her contacts to investigate his financial activities. What she found was even worse than I had imagined. Bob wasn't just living a double life. He was living it with our money. Over the past 3 years, he had systematically withdrawn money from our savings and retirement accounts, claiming the funds were for business expenses related to his consulting work. In reality, he had been using our money to support his relationship with Sarah. Linda showed me bank records indicating that Bob had spent nearly $85 of our joint savings on his secret life. He had paid for Sarah's engagement ring, their wedding, their honeymoon to Hawaii, furniture for the apartment they shared in Millerville, and even helped pay for Sarah's daughter's college tuition. He's been essentially stealing from you to fund his relationship with another woman. Linda explained as we sat in her kitchen reviewing the evidence. And because you're legally married, he's had access to all your joint accounts. The financial betrayal hurt almost as much as the emotional one. For 40 years, I had trusted Bob completely with our money. I had never questioned his decisions, never asked to see bank statements, never doubted that he was acting in both our best interests. Meanwhile, he had been systematically robbing our future to pay for his happiness with someone else. But Linda's investigation revealed something even more shocking. Sarah wasn't just Bob's other wife. She didn't know about me. I managed to strike up a conversation with her at the real estate office where she works. Linda reported. She believes Bob is a widower. She thinks his first wife, you, died of cancer 5 years ago. She has no idea you exist. This revelation changed everything. I had been thinking of Sarah as Bob's co-conspirator, someone who had knowingly participated in his deception. But she was as much a victim as I was. Bob had lied to both of us, creating elaborate fictional narratives to keep his two lives separate. What kind of man does this? I asked Linda. What kind of person can lie so completely to two women who love him? Someone with a serious psychological disorder, Linda said bluntly. This isn't just cheating, Maggie. This is pathological deception on a massive scale. Bob has created two entirely separate identities and managed to maintain both for years. That takes planning, calculation, and a complete lack of empathy for the people he's hurting. The more I learned about Bob's deception, the more I realized how little I had actually known about the man I had been married to for 40 years. The Bob who came home to me every few days wasn't my husband. He was a character Bob played when he wasn't being his real self with Sarah. Linda's surveillance revealed the details of Bob's routine. He would leave our house claiming to have consulting work, drive to Millerville, and spend 3 or 4 days at a time living with Sarah in their shared apartment. They went grocery shopping together, attended church together, socialized with other couples who knew them as newlyweds. Bob had business cards identifying him as a retired insurance executive, and Sarah's friends and family knew him as her devoted second husband who had found love again after the tragic loss of his first wife. When Linda showed me photos from her surveillance, I barely recognized Bob. In Millerville, he dressed differently, more casually, more youthfully. He smiled more, laughed more, seemed more relaxed and genuinely happy than I had seen him in years. He looked like a man who was living his authentic life, not like someone who was deceiving two women and stealing money to fund his elaborate lies. The question now, Linda said, is what you want to do with this information. You have enough evidence to file for divorce and probably criminal charges for bigamy and theft. You could expose him to Sarah, destroy his second marriage, and make sure he faces consequences for what he's done. I sat in Linda's kitchen, surrounded by photos and documents that detailed my husband's betrayal, and tried to figure out what justice would look like. Bob had stolen my money, my trust, and 40 years of my life. He had made a mockery of our marriage vows and turned our entire relationship into an elaborate lie. But as angry as I was, I found myself thinking about Sarah. She was innocent in all this. She thought she had found love with a widowed man who cherished her. Learning the truth about Bob would devastate her just as it had devastated me. Did she deserve that pain just because I wanted revenge? I need some time to think, I told Linda. This is bigger than I ever imagined. Take all the time you need, Linda said. But Maggie, there's one more thing you need to consider. Bob is committing multiple felonies. Bigamy is a crime, and so is the theft of marital assets. If you decide not to pursue this legally, he could do it again. To Sarah or to some other unsuspecting woman. That night, I sat alone in my living room while Bob was at what he claimed was a business dinner, but which I now knew was probably a romantic evening with Sarah. I spread Linda's evidence across my coffee table and tried to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. Did I want to be the woman who quietly divorced her cheating husband and tried to rebuild her life with dignity? Did I want to be the woman who exposed Bob's crimes and made sure he faced the full consequences of his actions? Did I want to be the woman who protected Sarah from the truth? Or the woman who made sure Sarah knew what kind of man she had married? For the first time in my adult life, I had complete control over a major decision. Bob's deception had freed me from any obligation to consider his feelings or protect his reputation. What happened next would be entirely my choice. The question was, Who did I want to be now that I was finally free to choose? I made my decision on a Thursday morning in early May, 3 weeks after Linda had finished her investigation. Bob was in the shower, getting ready for another supposed consulting trip, and I was sitting at our kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. The night before, I had watched Bob pack his overnight bag with the same casual routine. He had performed dozens of times over the past 3 years. He had hummed while he folded his shirts, smiled while he selected his best cologne, and kissed my forehead before bed with what I now recognized as the relief of a man who was about to escape back to his real life. But what finally pushed me to action wasn't anger or revenge. It was something Bob said as he was leaving for his trip. I should be back Sunday evening, he told me, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. But if the client needs me to stay longer, it might be Monday or Tuesday. Of course, I said automatically. I understand. But as I watched him walk to his car with that familiar spring in his step, I realized I couldn't say those words anymore. I couldn't keep pretending to understand and support his lies. I couldn't keep enabling his deception by being the compliant wife who never questioned anything. Most importantly, I couldn't keep letting him steal our money to fund his happiness with another woman. Over the past 3 weeks, I had spent hours thinking about what Linda had told me about justice and consequences. Bob was committing crimes, bigamy, theft. Fraud, he was hurting people, me, Sarah. Probably others I didn't even know about. If I stayed silent, I was allowing him to continue. But I had also been thinking about what I wanted for my own life. Did I want to spend whatever years I had left trying to rebuild a marriage with a man who had betrayed me so completely? Did I want to grow old with someone I could never trust again? The answer was no. I wanted a different life. I wanted a life where I wasn't constantly wondering if the man beside me was telling the truth. I wanted a life where I didn't have to worry about discovering new betrayals and new lies. I wanted a life where I could be valued and cherished by someone who actually wanted to be with me. That morning, while Bob was singing in the shower before leaving to spend another long weekend with his other wife, I called Linda. I've made my decision, I told her. I want to move forward. But I want to do it strategically. I don't want to just blow up his life randomly. I want to protect myself first. And then I want to make sure he faces appropriate consequences. Linda came over that afternoon with a legal pad and her laptop. We spent several hours developing what she called an action plan. The first priority was protecting my financial interests. Linda had already documented Bob's theft of our joint savings, but we needed to prevent him from taking more money while I prepared for divorce proceedings. Can you get access to all your financial accounts? Linda asked. I think so, I said. Bob handles most of our banking online, and I've seen him enter his passwords. He's never tried to hide them from me. That evening, after Bob left for Millerville, I spent 3 hours on our computer accessing every bank account, retirement fund, and investment account Bob had managed for us. What I found was both better and worse than I had expected. Better because Bob hadn't stolen as much as he could have. We still had about 180,000 in various accounts, enough for me to live comfortably if I was careful. Worse because I could see the pattern of his theft laid out in black and white. Over 3 years he had made dozens of withdrawals ranging from 500 to 5,000, each one carefully designed to avoid triggering any automatic alerts. He had been methodical and calculating in his deception, taking just enough to fund his relationship with Sarah, without making it obvious that large amounts were missing. With Linda's help, I opened new accounts in my name only and began the process of protecting our remaining assets. Linda's ex-husband was a lawyer who specialized in family law, and he agreed to represent me when I was ready to file for divorce. The financial evidence alone gives you a very strong case, he told me during a consultation the following week. Combined with the bigamy, Bob won't have much leverage in divorce negotiations. But I have to warn you, this could get ugly. When people are caught in this kind of massive deception, they sometimes become desperate and unpredictable. I wasn't worried about Bob becoming violent. In 40 years of marriage, he had never raised his voice to me, let alone his hand. But I was concerned about what he might do financially if he realized I was onto him. Linda suggested I move quickly once I decided to confront him. The question remained, how and when to reveal what I knew. Linda had advised me to consider telling Sarah first before confronting Bob. If you tell Bob first, he'll immediately call Sarah and try to control the narrative, she explained. He might convince her that you're lying, or mentally unstable, or seeking revenge. But if Sarah knows the truth first, Bob won't be able to manipulate her as easily. The idea of talking to Sarah terrified me, but I knew Linda was right. Sarah deserved to know the truth, and she deserved to hear it from someone who had been victimized the same way she had been. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to make the call. On a Tuesday morning in late May, while Bob was supposedly at a local client meeting, I dialed the number for Henderson Real Estate, where Sarah worked. "Henderson Real Estate, this is Sarah," came a cheerful voice on the other end of the line. My heart hammered in my chest. This was the woman my husband had married. The woman he spent half his time with. The woman he was happier with than he had ever been with me. "Sarah," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound calm. "My name is Margaret Johnson. I need to speak with you about Robert Johnson. I believe you know him as your husband." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "I think you have the wrong number. My husband's first wife passed away from cancer several years ago." "No," I said gently. "I'm very much alive. And I'm Robert's legal wife of 40 years. I think we need to talk." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. Sarah was understandably skeptical at first, then shocked, then devastated as I explained what I had discovered. I emailed her copies of Linda's investigation reports and some of the wedding photos from Bob's computer. Photos that proved I had access to his personal files and accounts. Sarah agreed to meet me the following day at a coffee shop in Millerville, halfway between our two worlds. I had never been more nervous about anything in my life. What do you say to the woman your husband has been deceiving for years? What do you say to someone who is about to learn that her marriage is a lie and her husband is a criminal? Sarah was smaller than she appeared in the wedding photos and prettier. She had kind eyes and an open, honest face, the face of someone who trusted people and believed the best of them. She looked like the kind of woman who would believe a man who told her his first wife had died of cancer and he was ready to love again. We sat across from each other in a small cafe. Two women who had been married to the same man, trying to piece together the truth of our shared deception. "I can't believe this is real," Sarah said after I had shown her more evidence and explained everything Linda had discovered. "Bob talks about his first wife, about you, all the time. He keeps a photo of you on his desk and says he still misses you terribly." This was somehow more hurtful than anything else I had learned. Bob had turned me into a saint in death, loving the memory of me in a way he had never loved the reality of me in life. "He's been stealing from our joint accounts to pay for your life together," I told Sarah as gently as I could. "Your engagement ring, your wedding, your honeymoon. It was all paid for with money he took from me without permission." Sarah began to cry. "He paid for Emma's tuition," she whispered. "My daughter's college tuition. He said he wanted to help because he knew how hard it was for me as a single mother." Even Bob's generosity towards Sarah's daughter had been funded by stolen money. There was no part of their relationship that wasn't built on lies and theft. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to divorce him," I said. "And I think you should talk to a lawyer about getting your marriage annulled. Since Bob was already married when he married you, your marriage isn't legally valid." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "This explains so much. He was always gone half the time, always saying he had to visit your gravesite or handle estate issues related to your death. I thought he was just having trouble letting go of the past." We spent 2 hours in that coffee shop, two women who had loved the same man, trying to understand how we had both been so completely fooled. Sarah was younger than me, more financially independent, more modern in her thinking. But she had been just as trusting, just as willing to believe in love and commitment, and the possibility of happiness. When we parted that afternoon, we had agreed on a plan. Sarah would confront Bob the next time he came to Millerville, which was supposed to be that weekend. She would record the conversation if possible, and demand a full confession. Then she would ask him to leave and never contact her again. Meanwhile, I would have divorce papers prepared, and would confront Bob when he returned home from what he expected would be a normal weekend with Sarah. Sarah asked as we stood beside our cars in the parking lot. I'm ready to stop living a lie, I said. I'm ready to find out who I am when I'm not being deceived. Sarah smiled through her tears. Maybe we can stay in touch, she said. I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like we've been through something together. We understand each other. I hugged this woman, who had been my unwitting rival for 3 years, and realized she was right. We had been through something together. We had both loved the same man, both been betrayed by him, both been forced to discover that our lives were built on lies. But we had also both been strong enough to face the truth when it was revealed. We had both chosen reality over comfortable deception. We had both decided we deserved better than being married to a man who could look us in the eyes and lie every single day. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my future. For the first time in decades, I didn't know what was going to happen next. My life was about to change completely, and while that was terrifying, it was also liberating. I was done being the woman who trusted blindly and asked no questions. I was done being the woman who enabled deception by being too polite to demand honesty. I was ready to be the woman who stood up for herself, who demanded truth, who refused to accept less than she deserved. Bob's world was about to come crashing down, but mine was about to begin. Sarah called me on Saturday evening. I could tell from her voice that she had been crying. I did it, she said simply. I confronted him. I have it all recorded. My hands shook as I held the phone. What happened? How did he react? At first, he tried to deny everything. He said you must be mentally ill, that grief had made you delusional. He said you had been stalking him since your supposed death, creating elaborate fantasies about being married to him. Even knowing Bob was capable of such lies, his willingness to destroy my reputation to protect his deception still shocked me. But then I showed him the bank records you had given me. Sarah continued, the ones showing the withdrawals from your joint accounts, matched with deposits into our shared expenses. When he saw those, he just collapsed. Sarah had recorded the entire confrontation on her phone. That evening, she sent me the audio file, and I listened to my husband's voice as his world fell apart. The recording began with Sarah asking Bob to sit down, saying she had something important to discuss with him. Bob's voice was cheerful, unsuspecting. What's up, sweetheart? You sound serious. Bob, I had an interesting phone call this week. From your wife, Margaret. There was a long silence, then Bob's voice suddenly strained. Sarah, what are you talking about? You know Margaret passed away years ago. No, Bob. She's very much alive. And she's been married to you for 40 years, which means our marriage isn't legal. Which means you're a bigamist and I've been unknowingly participating in a crime. What followed was 20 minutes of Bob alternating between denial, excuses, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince Sarah that I was lying. He claimed I was his ex-wife who had become obsessed with him after their divorce. He said I was mentally unstable and had been harassing him for years. He begged Sarah not to believe that crazy woman. But Sarah had evidence, and she wasn't backing down. Explain this bank statement, Bob. Her voice said on the recording. This shows you withdrawing $5,000 from an account shared with Margaret Johnson on the same day you paid for our honeymoon. If she's dead, how is she sharing a bank account with you? That's when Bob's voice changed. The charm disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. Fine, he said. Yes, Margaret is alive. Yes, we're still technically married. But Sarah, you have to understand. That marriage has been over for years. We live like strangers. I only stayed because divorce would have been too complicated financially. What we have is real. What I have with her is just paperwork. Paperwork? Sarah's voice rose. Bob, you married me. We exchanged vows. You told me you loved me more than you had ever loved anyone. I do love you more than I've ever loved anyone, Bob said, his voice becoming pleading. Margaret and I never had what you and I have. She's background noise in my life. You're my real wife, the one that matters. Listening to Bob dismiss our 40-year marriage as background noise was like being slapped. But it also clarified something for me. This wasn't a man who had made a mistake or gotten in over his head. This was a man who was capable of reducing human beings to inconveniences when they stood in the way of what he wanted. The recording continued with Sarah demanding that Bob leave their apartment and never contact her again. Bob became increasingly desperate, making promises and threats in equal measure. "If you leave me, I'll have nothing," he said. "Sarah, please. I'll figure something out. I'll divorce Margaret. We can make this work. You should have divorced Margaret before you married me." Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. "What you've done is unforgivable. To both of us. I want you to pack your things and leave. Don't come back, don't call me, don't try to contact Emma. It's over." The recording ended with the sound of Bob crying, begging Sarah to reconsider, promising to do anything to make it right. Sarah's voice was firm. "The only thing you can do to make this right is to leave us alone and turn yourself in to the police." After I finished listening to the recording, I sat in my living room feeling strangely calm. Tomorrow, Bob would come home expecting to return to his normal routine of lies and deception. Instead, he would find divorce papers and a wife who knew everything. I spent Sunday preparing. Linda came over to help me organize all our evidence: financial records, photos, email printouts, surveillance reports. We arranged everything in neat folders, creating an undeniable paper trail of Bob's crimes. Bob's lawyer, who would soon be his former lawyer, had prepared divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences and demanding an equal split of our remaining assets, plus restitution for the money Bob had stolen. Linda had also contacted the district attorney's office about the criminal charges Bob would face. "Are you ready for this?" Linda asked as we finished our preparations. I thought about the question. Was I ready to confront the man I had been married to for 40 years? Was I ready to watch him lie to my face one more time before I revealed that I knew the truth? Was I ready to end my marriage and start over at 67 years old? "I'm ready," I said, and realized I meant it. Bob came home Sunday evening right on schedule, humming the same tune he had been humming for weeks. But something was different about him. He looked haggard, older somehow, and he didn't meet my eyes when he came through the door. "How was your trip?" I asked, following our usual script. "Fine," he said, but his voice lacked its usual cheerfulness. "Just fine. Look, Maggie, I'm really tired. I think I'll just go to bed early tonight." "Actually," I said, "I think we need to talk first. Could you sit down?" Bob looked at me with something approaching worriness. "What about?" "About Sarah Henderson." Bob went completely still. The color drained from his face, and for a moment I thought he might faint. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was barely a whisper. I walked to the coffee table where Linda and I had arranged our evidence. I picked up the wedding photos and handed them to Bob. "You look very happy in these pictures," I said. "Sarah is lovely. I can see why you fell in love with her." Bob stared at the photos in his hands, and I watched 40 years of lies crumble around him. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled, and he suddenly looked like a very old, very tired man. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. 3 weeks. "Linda helped me investigate after I discovered you weren't really at Henderson and Associates that night you missed our anniversary." Bob looked up at me with something like surprise. "God, Maggie, I'm so sorry about that. I never meant for any of this to happen." "But it did happen," I said, sitting down across from him. "You married another woman while you were married to me. You stole $85,000 from our joint accounts to pay for your relationship with her. You lied to me every single day for 3 years. It wasn't supposed to go this far," Bob said, setting the photos on the table with shaking hands. "I met Sarah at a real estate seminar 4 years ago. She was recently divorced, struggling to raise her daughter alone. She was so different from. She was so full of life. So excited about everything. I felt young again when I was with her. So you decided to pretend you were available." I told her I was separated, going through a difficult divorce. That was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out what to do. But then she started talking about wanting to get married again, about wanting security and commitment. And I loved her, Maggie. I loved her in a way I hadn't felt in years. Bob's confession continued for over an hour. He told me about creating the fake consulting business to explain his absences. He told me about gradually withdrawing money from our accounts to support 2 households. He told me about the elaborate lies he had told Sarah about my supposed death, creating a fictional version of our marriage where he had been a devoted husband tragically widowed. "I convinced myself I was protecting you," he said. "I thought if I could just keep everything separate, nobody would get hurt. You would have your life, Sarah would have hers, and I could have both. And what about what I wanted? I asked. Did you ever consider that I might want a husband who actually wanted to be married to me? Did you ever think about how it felt to live with someone who was just going through the motions? Bob was quiet for a long time. I know I hurt you, he said finally. I know there's no excuse for what I did, but Maggie, we haven't been happy together in years. You have to admit that. He was right, and we both knew it. Our marriage had become a habit, a routine neither of us questioned or particularly enjoyed. But that didn't justify what he had done. Being unhappy doesn't give you the right to lie and steal and commit bigamy, I said. It gives you the right to ask for a divorce. I was scared, Bob admitted. Scared of hurting you, scared of the financial complications, scared of starting over. It seemed easier to just manage both situations. I handed Bob the divorce papers. It's not going to be easier anymore, I said. I'm divorcing you, and I'm pressing criminal charges for bigamy and theft. Sarah is doing the same. Bob stared at the papers as if he couldn't understand what they were. Criminal charges? Maggie, please. I'll pay back every penny. I'll do anything you want. What I want is for you to face the consequences of your choices, I said. What I want is for you to understand that actions have consequences, and that you can't manipulate and deceive people without eventually paying a price. Bob began to cry then, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere profound, he said. Sarah won't even talk to me. Her daughter won't speak to me. And now you? You didn't lose everything, Bob, I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. You threw it away. You had a wife who loved you, a comfortable life, financial security, and respect in the community. You chose to gamble all of that for something you thought would make you happier. It did make me happier, he said quietly. For a while. It really did. And was it worth it? Bob looked around our living room, at the 40 years of shared memories, at the life he was about to lose, at the evidence of his crimes spread across the coffee table. No, he said finally. No, it wasn't worth it. Bob moved out that night, taking only what he could fit in his car. The next morning, Linda drove me to the police station where I filed formal charges against my husband of 40 years. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings or the paperwork, or even watching Bob led away in handcuffs when they arrested him 3 days later. The hardest part was walking back into our empty house and realizing that for the first time in 4 decades, I was truly alone. But as I sat in the quiet of my living room that first evening, I realized something else. Alone didn't necessarily mean lonely. For 3 years, I had been living with a man who was never really there, who was always thinking about somewhere else, someone else. Now I was alone, but I was also free. Free from lies, free from deception, free from the exhausting work of loving someone who didn't love me back. It was terrifying. But it was also the beginning of something new. The first week alone in the house was the longest of my life. For 40 years, my days had been structured around Bob's schedule, his needs, his preferences. I cooked what he liked, watched the television programs he enjoyed, went to bed when he was tired. Without him there, I felt like an actor who had forgotten her lines. I would wake up at 6 o'clock and automatically start making coffee for 2 before remembering I only needed 1 cup. I would find myself cooking enough dinner for 2 people, then eating leftovers for days. I would reach for the television remote to change the channel, then realize I could watch whatever I wanted. The silence was the hardest part. Bob had always been a talker, filling any quiet moments with commentary about the news, observations about the neighbors, or stories from his supposed consulting work. I had grown so accustomed to the constant background noise of his voice that the quiet of the empty house felt oppressive. But gradually, something unexpected began to happen. The silence stopped feeling empty and started feeling peaceful. I could think my own thoughts without interruption. I could make decisions. What to eat, what to watch, what to do with my day, without considering anyone else's preferences. 3 days after Bob moved out, Linda came over with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we sat at my kitchen table. "I don't know," I said honestly. Some moments I feel relieved, like a weight has been lifted. Other moments I feel terrified. I've never lived alone in my entire life. I went from my parents' house to marriage with Bob. Linda nodded. "That's normal. You're grieving, but you're also discovering. It takes time to figure out who you are when you're not defined by your relationship to someone else. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Bob was arrested. His lawyer, a different one than the family attorney Linda's ex-husband had recommended to me, advised him to plead guilty to avoid a lengthy trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and fighting the charges would only make things worse for him. Bob was sentenced to 18 months in county jail for bigamy and theft. He was also ordered to pay full restitution for the money he had stolen, plus court costs and attorney fees. The judge was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "you have committed crimes that go beyond mere theft or fraud. You have systematically deceived two women who trusted you, stolen money that was meant to support your family's future, and shown a complete disregard for the law and basic human decency. The fact that you maintained this deception for years shows a level of calculation and callousness that this court finds deeply troubling." I attended Bob's sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Linda. Bob looked smaller somehow, diminished in his Orange County jail jumpsuit. When he was led away in shackles, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being done, but it was still painful to watch the man I had loved for so many years being taken away to prison. Sarah also attended the hearing. Afterward, we went to lunch together. Two women trying to make sense of what had happened to us. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he had just been honest?" Sarah asked as we sat in a quiet restaurant downtown. "If he had asked you for a divorce and then started dating me like a normal person?" I had thought about that question many times. "I think I would have been hurt and sad, but I would have understood," I said. "People fall out of love, people change, people want different things. What I can't understand is the elaborate deception. The years of lies, the way he made both of us unknowing participants in his crimes." "My therapist says it's about control," Sarah said. "He wanted to have everything. His comfortable marriage with you, his exciting relationship with me, financial security, social respectability. Normal people have to choose. But Bob thought he was special, that he could have it all if he was just clever enough." Sarah and I had both started seeing therapists to help us process what had happened. Mine, Dr. Williams, specialized in helping older adults navigate major life transitions. She helped me understand that my feelings of confusion and fear were normal responses to having my entire reality turned upside down. "You spent 40 years being one half of a couple," Dr. Williams explained during one of our sessions. "Your identity was largely defined by being Bob's wife. Now you have to figure out who Margaret Johnson is when she's not somebody's wife. That's exciting, but it's also frightening." She was right. At 67, I was learning things about myself that I had never had the opportunity to discover. I learned that I actually preferred silence to constant conversation. I learned that I liked spicy food, which Bob had never enjoyed, so I had rarely cooked it. I learned that I was more social than I had realized. Bob had always been the one who arranged our social activities, and without him, I discovered I enjoyed reaching out to friends and neighbors on my own. The divorce was finalized 4 months after Bob's arrest. Because of his criminal conviction and the documented theft of our money, the settlement was heavily in my favor. I received the house, most of our remaining savings and investments, and a lie-in on Bob's future earnings to ensure full restitution for what he had stolen. Linda helped me develop a financial plan for my new life as a single woman. With careful budgeting, I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I wouldn't be wealthy, but I would be secure. "You could even travel if you wanted to," Linda said as we reviewed my finances. "You always talked about wanting to see Europe. Now there's nothing stopping you." The idea of traveling alone intimidated me, but it also intrigued me. For years, Bob had dismissed my interest in travel, saying it was too expensive and too much trouble. Now I could go anywhere I wanted. I started small. 6 months after the divorce was final, I took my first solo trip, a long weekend in Charleston, South Carolina. I had always wanted to see the historic district and the beautiful gardens, but Bob had never been interested. That weekend was a revelation. I walked at my own pace, ate at restaurants that appealed to me, spent hours in museums and gardens without worrying about someone else getting bored. I struck up conversations with other tourists, something I had rarely done when traveling with Bob, who preferred to keep to ourselves. On my last evening in Charleston, I sat on the porch of my bed and breakfast, watching the sunset and sipping a glass of wine. For the first time since discovering Bob's betrayal, I felt genuinely happy. Not just relieved or grateful or determined. Actually happy. I was happy to be alone with my thoughts. I was happy to have made decisions about my day based solely on what interested me. I was happy to be discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. When I returned home from Charleston, I made a decision that would have shocked the woman I had been a year earlier. I decided to sell the house. The house held too many memories of my life with Bob. Every room reminded me of routines we had shared, conversations we had had, lies he had told me while standing in familiar spaces. I wanted a fresh start in a place that was entirely my own. Linda helped me find a smaller house in a different neighborhood. A charming cottage with a garden that needed work and enough space for me to have a real office for the first time in my life. I had decided to volunteer with a literacy program, helping adults learn to read, and I wanted a dedicated space where I could prepare lessons and meet with students. The process of packing up 40 years of shared possessions was both painful and liberating. I found love letters Bob had written me in the early years of our marriage, when his affection had been genuine. I found photo albums documenting our life together, vacations, holidays, anniversaries. I found gifts he had given me over the years, back when he had paid attention to what I liked. But I also found evidence of who I had been before I became Bob's wife. College textbooks I had saved, artwork I had created in a pottery class years earlier, journals I had kept before I got married. I had forgotten how much I had enjoyed writing, how I used to fill pages with observations about the world around me and dreams for my future. As I packed these remnants of my younger self, I realized that being married to Bob hadn't just hidden his true nature from me. It had hidden my true nature from myself. I had become so focused on being a good wife that I had forgotten to be an interesting person. My new house felt like a sanctuary. I painted the walls colors that I loved, soft blues and greens that Bob would have called too bold. I bought furniture that suited my taste rather than his, a comfortable reading chair, a desk where I could write, bookshelves to display all the books Bob had always said made the house look cluttered. For the first time in decades, I was living in a space that reflected who I was rather than who I thought I should be. 8 months after moving into my new house, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Bob, calling from the county jail where he was serving his sentence. Maggie. His voice said through the crackling jail phone connection. Thank you for accepting my call. I wasn't sure you would. I had been listed as an approved contact because the lawyers thought he might have information relevant to the restitution proceedings, but I was surprised to hear from him. What do you want, Bob? I asked. I wanted to apologize, he said. I know it's too little too late, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did to you. What I took from you wasn't just money. It was years of your life. It was your trust. It was your sense of reality. I was quiet for a moment. Yes, I said finally. That's exactly what you took. Are you happy now? He asked. I heard from your lawyer that you sold the house, that you're starting over. Are you okay? It was a strange question coming from the man who had destroyed my life and then rebuilt it for me by forcing me to discover who I really was. I said, I'm happy, Bob. Really happy. For the first time in years, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I'm glad, he said finally, and I thought he meant it. I'm glad you found a way to be happy without me. I know I never made you truly happy, even before Sarah. I know I wasn't a good husband to you. After we hung up, I sat in my sunny kitchen in my new house, thinking about forgiveness and second chances and the strange ways life can break you down only to build you up stronger than before. I wasn't ready to forgive Bob completely. I might never be. But I was grateful to him for one thing: his betrayal had forced me to discover that I was stronger, more capable, and more interesting than I had ever imagined. At 67 years old, I was finally learning who I really was. 1 year after my divorce was finalized, I stood in the community center classroom where I taught my weekly literacy class, watching as Maria, a 53-year-old woman from El Salvador, read her first complete paragraph in English. Her face glowed with pride as she finished, and the other students in the class burst into spontaneous applause. I did it, Mrs. Margaret, Maria said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I read the whole thing without help. Yes, you did, I said, feeling my own eyes fill with tears. You worked so hard for this moment. Teaching adult literacy had become more than just volunteer work for me. It had become my passion. 3 evenings a week, I worked with adults who were learning to read for the first time or learning to read in English. Many of them were women who, like me, had spent decades in situations where other people made decisions for them. They had never learned to read because their families didn't believe women needed education, or because they had been too busy working to support their families, or because they had been told they weren't smart enough to learn. Watching these women discover their own intelligence and capability reminded me of my own journey over the past 2 years. We were all learning that it was never too late to become who we were meant to be. After class that evening, Linda came by to pick me up for our weekly dinner. She had become my closest friend, the sister I had never had. Our shared experience with Bob's investigation had bonded us, but our friendship had grown far beyond that difficult beginning. "How was class tonight?" Linda asked as we drove to our favorite restaurant. "Wonderful," I said. Maria read her first full paragraph, and Janet finished her GD application. "I think she's going to do it. She's going to get her diploma at 62. Linda smiled. "You know what I love about your work? You're not just teaching people to read. You're teaching them to believe in themselves." She was right. That's exactly what I was doing, because it's what I had learned to do for myself. Over dinner, Linda updated me on her latest cases, and I told her about my plans for the summer. I had signed up for a European river cruise, something I had dreamed about for years but never thought I would have the courage to do alone. "I'm so proud of you," Linda said. 2 years ago, you were afraid to drive to Millerville by yourself. Now you're planning to sail down the Danube." It was true. The woman I was now would be unrecognizable to the woman I had been when Bob disappeared on our anniversary night. That woman had been passive, dependent, afraid to question or challenge or demand better for herself. This woman made her own decisions, traveled alone, stood up for what she believed in, and wasn't afraid to be by herself. After dinner, I drove home to my cottage, still marveling sometimes at the simple pleasure of coming home to a space that was entirely my own. I had painted the living room a soft sage green, filled it with books and plants, and created a reading nook by the window where I spent hours every weekend with a cup of tea and whatever novel had caught my interest. That evening, I had plans to video chat with Sarah. She and I had maintained our friendship over the past year, bonding over our shared experience and our mutual journey of healing. Sarah had moved to a new city after Bob's arrest, starting fresh with her daughter Emma. She was thriving in her new life, just as I was thriving in mine. "You look wonderful," Sarah said when her face appeared on my laptop screen. She was calling from her new apartment in Denver, where she had taken a job with a real estate development company. "So do you," I said, and meant it. Sarah looked younger, somehow lighter. The strain and confusion that had marked her face during our first meetings were gone, replaced by the confidence of a woman who had survived betrayal and come out stronger. Sarah said, her eyes sparkling. "I met someone." I felt a genuine surge of happiness for her. "Tell me everything." Sarah had met David at a hiking club she had joined in Denver. He was a retired teacher, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. He was honest about his past, patient with Sarah's trust issues, and completely transparent about his finances, his schedule, and his feelings. "The best part," Sarah said, "is that I'm not the same person I was with Bob. I ask questions now. I pay attention to inconsistencies. I trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. I'll never be fooled like that again." "Good for you," I said. "You deserve someone who treasures you exactly as you are." After we ended our call, I sat in my reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this place. 2 years ago, I had thought my story was over, that I was simply living out the final chapters of a life that had been defined entirely by my marriage to Bob. Now I understood that Bob's betrayal, as devastating as it had had actually been a gift. It had forced me to discover reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. It had pushed me to build a life based on my own interests and values rather than someone else's expectations. It had taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely. I thought about the other women in my literacy class, many of whom were facing their own challenges. Divorces, widowhood, children leaving home, careers ending. I tried to share with them what I had learned, that starting over, no matter how scary, could be the beginning of the best chapter of your life. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the caller ID and saw a number I didn't recognize. Hello, Mrs. Johnson. This is Detective Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about Robert Johnson. My heart skipped. Bob had been released from jail 3 months earlier and was living in a halfway house about an hour away. He was required to pay monthly restitution and wasn't supposed to contact me directly. But I occasionally received updates about his case from the legal system. Has something happened? I asked. No, ma'am, nothing like that. Mr. Johnson has requested permission to write you a letter as part of his restitution agreement. Any contact with you has to be approved. Would you be willing to receive a letter from him? I considered the question. I hadn't spoken to Bob since that phone call from jail almost a year earlier. I had no desire to rebuild a relationship with him, but I was curious about what he might want to say. Yes, I said. I'll accept a letter. The letter arrived a week later. Bob's handwriting was the same as always, neat, precise, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades filling out insurance forms. Dear Maggie, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to respond. But there are things I needed to say, and I hope you'll give me the chance to say them. The letter continued for 3 pages. Bob wrote about his time in jail, about the therapy sessions he had been required to attend, about his growing understanding of the damage he had caused. He wrote about seeing Sarah's engagement announcement in the Denver newspaper. She had sent it to me as well, and feeling genuinely happy for her. I know this will sound strange, he wrote, but I think losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I'm glad I hurt you and Sarah. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But because it forced me to confront who I really was, and to start becoming someone better. I'm in therapy now, real therapy, not just the court-mandated sessions. I'm learning about why I felt the need to live so many lies, why I thought I could control everything and everyone around me. I'm learning to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. The truth is, Maggie, I was a coward. I was too afraid to face the problems in our marriage, too afraid to ask for what I needed, too afraid to hurt you by being honest about my feelings. So instead, I hurt you in the worst possible way by lying about everything. You deserved a husband who loved you completely, who was present in your marriage, who shared his real thoughts and feelings with you. You deserved honesty and respect and partnership. I'm sorry I couldn't be that man for you. But I'm glad, so glad, that you found the strength to build a life without me. I hear things occasionally through legal channels, and I know you're teaching now, that you have your own place, that you're happy. That makes me happier than you might believe. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for another chance. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I took from you, and I'm genuinely sorry. You are an extraordinary woman, Maggie Johnson. You always were. I just wasn't smart enough to see it when it mattered. I hope your new life brings you all the joy and fulfillment you deserve. With sincere regret and respect, Bob. I read the letter twice, then set it aside and made myself a cup of tea. Bob's words seemed sincere, but I had learned not to trust his words. What mattered wasn't what he said, but what he had done, and what I had chosen to do in response. What I had chosen to do was build a life filled with purpose, friendship, learning, and genuine contentment. I had chosen to help other women discover their own strength. I had chosen to travel, to take risks, to say yes to opportunities that scared me. I had chosen to become the woman I was meant to be all along. The next morning, I sat at my desk and wrote a response to Bob's letter. It was shorter than his, just 1 page. Bob, I wrote, thank you for your letter and your apology. I accept your regret as sincere, and I'm glad you're working to become a better person. You're right that I deserved better from our marriage, but I want you to know that I don't regret our years together, even knowing how they ended. Those years taught me many things, including how to be grateful for what I have now. I have forgiven you, not because you've earned it, but because carrying anger was holding me back from the life I wanted to build. Forgiveness doesn't mean I would ever trust you again, but it means I'm free to move forward without bitterness. I wish you well in your efforts to change. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even if it comes later in life than we might have hoped. Take care of yourself. Margaret. I sealed the letter and mailed it that afternoon, then drove to the community center for my literacy class. As I walked into the classroom, I saw Maria sitting at a table with a library book, reading quietly to herself. Janet was helping a newer student sound out difficult words. These women, like me, were discovering that it was never too late to learn something new, to become someone different, to write a better ending to their stories. At 68 years old, I was living the most authentic, fulfilling life I had ever known. I had learned that happiness wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you created through the choices you made every single day. I chose to be grateful instead of bitter. I chose to be brave instead of safe. I chose to be myself instead of who others expected me to be. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly who I was meant to be. As I looked around the classroom at these remarkable women who were rewriting their own stories, I smiled. We were all proof that it's never too late to start over, never too late to discover who you really are, never too late to create the life you truly want. My story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. THEND